You could hear it in his voice, the frustration, the pride, the refusal to bend. When reporters asked Doug Ford if he'd apologize to Donald Trump, his answer sliced through the noise like steel. "I'll never apologize to Donald Trump." No hesitation, no political filter, just raw defiance. In that single moment, Ford didn't just speak as Ontario's premier, he spoke for an entire nation tired of being humiliated by Washington's tantrums and tariffs. For months, Trump had mocked Canada's leadership, slapped duties on its industries, and treated its allies like bargaining chips. But this time, the pushback didn't come from Ottawa's polished podiums or foreign affairs press releases. It came from the blunt, unpolished voice of a provincial leader who'd simply had enough. Ford's words landed like a thunderclap across Canada. Every factory worker who'd lost hours, every farmer hit by trade chaos, every family paying more because of imported inflation, they heard him loud and clear. This wasn't about left or right. It was about respect. The kind of respect Canadians felt had been stripped away in endless rounds of political deals that always seemed to favor the louder neighbor to the south. And yet behind Ford's roar, something bigger was stirring. Because while the cameras fixated on his fire, another story was unfolding quietly, one that would test Canada's diplomacy, its unity, and its image on the world stage. A story led by a man whose silence often spoke louder than Ford's fury. Because as Ford raised his voice, Mark Carney chose something very different: calm. And that contrast would soon change everything. It wasn't just a press conference, it was a declaration. Doug Ford stood before the cameras with that familiar mix of grit and swagger, but this time the tone was different. He wasn't talking about Ontario's roads or taxes. He was talking about respect, the kind of respect he felt the United States had forgotten how to show. And when he said, "They could put me on a stretching rack, I still wouldn't apologize to Donald Trump," the message was unmistakable. Canada would no longer bow to American intimidation. In a single breath, Ford transformed frustration into a rallying cry. Across the country, his words ignited something rare: unity through defiance. It wasn't about partisan politics anymore. It was about national dignity. For months, Trump's administration had mocked Canada's industries, bullied its leaders, and weaponized tariffs against its closest ally. And yet, from the heart of Ontario came a voice that refused to flinch. Ford said what millions of Canadians had been feeling but didn't have the microphone to say: "That strength doesn't mean submission, it means standing tall, even when it costs you." The timing couldn't have been more symbolic. Trump's trade war was squeezing Canada's economy, testing its patience, and daring it to break. But instead of breaking, Ford doubled down. He reminded everyone that Canada wasn't a junior partner, it was a customer, a competitor, and an equal. "He needs us as much as we need him," Ford said, cutting through decades of diplomatic politeness. And in that moment, the political firebrand from Ontario became the unlikely face of Canadian resistance. But while Ford's roar was shaking headlines, somewhere else, thousands of miles away, another kind of strategy was quietly being written. A strategy not of fire but of finesse. The shockwaves from Doug Ford's statement didn't stop at Queen's Park. They tore through Ottawa like a political tremor. Within hours, the capital was buzzing. Newsrooms replayed his defiant words on a loop, analysts scrambled to decode the fallout, and members of Parliament whispered about what it meant for Canada's fragile relationship with Washington. Ford hadn't just thrown a punch at Trump, he'd thrown a wrench into the delicate machinery of diplomacy. In a country known for cautious words and measured tones, Ford's boldness was electric. He was saying out loud what others had only dared to mutter in private: that Canada was tired of being bullied by a man who treated trade like a weapon and allies like adversaries. It was a message that resonated from steel towns in Ontario to fishing ports in Nova Scotia, a reminder that national pride was worth more than political convenience. But in Ottawa, not everyone was cheering. Behind closed doors, advisors worried Ford's fire could complicate ongoing negotiations with Washington. Prime Minister Mark Carney, already walking a tightrope with Trump's administration, faced a new challenge: how to contain the heat without extinguishing the message. Because as much as Ford's defiance inspired the public, it risked provoking the very retaliation Canada was trying to avoid. Carney knew one wrong move could escalate tensions into an economic disaster. Yet he also understood that silencing Ford would look like surrender. So instead, he took a calculated risk, one that would surprise both his critics and his allies. While Ford roared for pride, Carney prepared to act for peace. And what he did next, a single, quiet gesture, would set off its own storm. When the story broke that Prime Minister Mark Carney had apologized to Donald Trump, the country froze. For some, it felt like betrayal. How could Canada's leader apologize after months of insults, tariffs, and public humiliation? But for others, especially those who understand Carney's style, it was clear: this wasn't submission. It was strategy. The spark had been an Ontario ad, one that used Ronald Reagan's voice to criticize Trump's tariffs. The White House was furious. Washington called it disrespectful, and Trump reportedly demanded an apology from Ottawa. Most leaders would have dodged the question, but Carney didn't. In a carefully worded statement, he said sorry for the tone of the ad, not for the message behind it. To the untrained eye, it looked like Canada backing down. But in reality, Carney was stepping back to take aim. He knew Trump's biggest weakness wasn't power, it was ego. So Carney gave him what he wanted, the illusion of victory. Behind that calm expression was a chess move worthy of a diplomat who'd weathered global financial crises. His apology didn't erase Ford's fire, it amplified it. It gave Canada contrast, one leader who could speak truth to power and another who could keep the lines open when the shouting stopped. Critics called it weakness. Supporters saw it for what it was: leverage. Because even as Trump ranted about winning, Carney's trade team was quietly securing access to Asian and European markets, making Canada less dependent on the US than ever before. Ford had played the fighter, Carney had played the diplomat, and together, without ever planning it, they'd cornered Washington into a position it couldn't easily escape. But no one yet realized how perfectly their opposites would align. Doug Ford and Mark Carney could not be more different. One thrives in confrontation, the other in calculation. Yet, in one of the most unexpected turns in Canadian politics, those opposites became the perfect allies. Ford's fire gave Canada its roar. Carney's calm gave it direction. Together, they formed something rare: balance. When reporters tried to bait Ford into attacking Carney's apology, he didn't take it. He showed restraint. "That's his prerogative," Ford said. "We're both working toward the same goal: protecting Canadian jobs." In those few words, Ford revealed what so many missed. This wasn't division, it was coordination. Carney's diplomacy worked best when backed by Ford's unapologetic defiance. Trump didn't know how to respond. Should he rage at the apology or the defiance that came with it? The mixed signals left Washington guessing, and that confusion became Canada's quiet weapon. While Ford was rallying domestic confidence, Carney was using that same momentum to strengthen Canada's image abroad. Asian and European leaders saw something they hadn't in years: a Canada united under pressure, capable of speaking with both strength and subtlety. Behind the scenes, trade negotiators described it as good cop, bad cop, but with higher stakes than any Hollywood script. And it worked. Ford's fire softened Trump's arrogance, while Carney's calm kept diplomacy alive. It was the kind of leadership duet that no one expected: a populist and a statesman, proving that unity doesn't mean uniformity. Together, they reminded the world that Canada could be tough without being toxic, proud without being petty. But Trump, who had built his image on dominance, wasn't used to being outmaneuvered by a pair of Canadians. He thought he could divide them. He couldn't. And his next move would reveal just how deeply he'd miscalculated. Donald Trump had always believed that Canada could be played, a polite neighbor too dependent on American trade to ever talk back. But Ford's defiance and Carney's diplomacy shattered that illusion. When Trump watched the clips of Ford declaring he'd never apologize, he reportedly fumed. Yet days later, when Carney extended a diplomatic apology, Trump thought he'd won. That was the miscalculation. He didn't realize that Carney wasn't conceding, he was controlling the tempo. Trump's tactic was simple: divide and dominate. He assumed the fiery Ford and the composed Carney would clash, weakening Canada's front. Instead, their coordination boxed him in. When Trump attacked Ford, Carney stayed silent, disarming. When Trump mocked Carney, Ford fought back, defiant. It created an unpredictable rhythm that Trump's team couldn't outmaneuver. Washington didn't know whether to shout or negotiate, and that confusion gave Canada the upper hand for the first time in years. Meanwhile, Carney quietly expanded Canada's leverage abroad. By the time Trump realized what was happening, Canada was already deepening trade corridors with Europe and Asia, redirecting supply chains that used to run through American ports. What started as a tariff war had turned into a transformation of Canada's global role, and it was leaving the White House behind. Trump had tried to weaponize pressure, but Canada turned it into progress. He tried to fracture alliances, but instead Ford's fury and Carney's restraint fused the country together. For decades, U.S. presidents had expected Ottawa to follow orders. Now Ottawa and even Queen's Park were writing their own playbook. And as the White House scrambled to save face, Canada was preparing to do something even more powerful: redefine what leadership looked like in the post-Trump era. At its core, this was never just a trade fight. It was a struggle over identity: who leads, who yields, and who decides when enough is enough. Ford's defiance wasn't only political theater, it was a cultural flashpoint. When he said he'd never apologize to Trump, Canadians heard more than words, they heard history catching up. The quiet country that once waited for approval from its southern neighbor was gone. In its place stood a nation learning how to wield its own pride without apology. Trump's America believed pressure could break that pride, but every insult, every tariff, every threat only hardened it. Canadians began to see themselves not as America's junior partner, but as a rival economic power capable of surviving without permission. Ford captured that emotion, blunt, raw, unapologetic. Carney refined it, strategic, steady, unstoppable. Together, they created a balance of heart and mind that spoke to something deeper than politics, confidence. That confidence began echoing far beyond North America. In Europe, leaders saw Canada as proof that quiet strength could outlast bluster. In Asia, Carney's composed diplomacy was opening doors that Washington had slammed shut. And at home, Ford's roar reminded ordinary citizens that patriotism wasn't about flags or slogans. It was about standing tall when the world tried to push you down. The real battle, it turned out, wasn't between leaders. It was between two forces inside every nation: pride and pressure. America chose pressure, Canada chose pride, and in doing so it found something it hadn't felt in years: unity. But one final moment would seal that transformation, a moment that showed the world exactly how much Canada had changed, and how far it was willing to go to protect its sovereignty. In the end, it wasn't a speech or a signature that defined this moment, it was a feeling. A quiet, collective realization that Canada no longer needed to measure its worth through Washington's approval. The world saw Ford's rage and Carney's restraint as opposites, but together they revealed something far more powerful: a country rediscovering its backbone. Ford's blunt defiance gave Canadians permission to feel angry, not reckless but justified. His fire was the emotional release after years of being talked down to, bullied in trade deals, and treated as a sidekick in global politics. Carney's calm diplomacy, on the other hand, reminded the world that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, and when it does, it's even harder to ignore. His apology wasn't submission, it was precision. It was the difference between ego and endurance. Together, they showed that leadership isn't about uniformity, it's about unity in contrast. Canada's strength didn't come from everyone agreeing, but from everyone pulling in the same direction. Ford spoke for the streets, Carney spoke for the boardrooms, and both spoke for the same flag. Their coordination turned chaos into strategy, frustration into focus, and pressure into power. Trump had underestimated Canada's quiet steel. He saw a divided neighbor and found a united front. He saw weakness and met resilience. By the time the dust settled, Washington's threats had lost their bite, and Canada had gained something priceless: credibility. For years, people asked whether Canada could stand tall against American aggression. Now the answer was clear: it already had. And as the world watched, one truth emerged from the storm: Canada's spine isn't made of politics, it's made of pride. When history looks back at this chapter, it won't remember it as just another trade dispute or diplomatic drama. It will remember it as the moment Canada stopped reacting and started leading. Doug Ford's refusal to apologize to Donald Trump wasn't just a soundbite, it was a spark. A bold, unfiltered declaration that this country would no longer bend under pressure, no longer play second to anyone, and no longer let fear dictate its future. And standing just across from that fire was Mark Carney, calm, strategic, deliberate. Two men, two styles, but one message to the world: Canada stands on its own terms. Carney's apology may have looked like surrender to those who only saw the headlines. But behind that composure was a masterclass in diplomacy. He gave Trump what he craved, the illusion of dominance, while quietly strengthening Canada's global footing. He turned noise into negotiation, anger into opportunity. Meanwhile, Ford's unapologetic stance kept the public united, proving that defiance can be patriotic when guided by purpose. Together, they reminded both allies and adversaries that Canada's strength isn't fragile, it's forged through contrast. Trump tried to divide. Instead, he built the very unity he feared. The fire and calm, the passion and patience, the roar and restraint, all fused into one unmistakable signal that echoed across the world: Canada won't be bullied. And perhaps that's the real story here, not about tariffs or politics, but about transformation. A once cautious nation learning how to command respect without losing grace. A country whose silence can be as powerful as its shout. Because in the end, strength isn't about fighting every battle. It's about knowing when to stand tall, when to stay silent, and when to remind the world Canada doesn't follow power. It defines it.